A woman's deepest pain does not always begin with rejection. Often, it begins much earlier, the moment she starts attaching meaning to what has not yet earned meaning. A little attention becomes emotional investment. A little chemistry becomes imagined destiny. A little inconsistency becomes a wound she tries to heal by loving harder. And this is where so many women lose themselves. Not because they feel too much, but because they do not yet see how easily the mind can transform desire into dependency, uncertainty into obsession, and silence into self-doubt. In this video, you will uncover the hidden psychology behind why some women chase, overthink, cling, and emotionally collapse, while others become grounded, self-respecting, and almost impossible to disturb. You will understand how attachment forms, why detachment restores power, and how a woman can become emotionally free without becoming cold. And stay until the end, because the final shift we discuss is the one that separates a woman who is ruled by her emotions from a woman who finally rules herself. Before we dive in, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. There is a quiet mistake many women make long before heartbreak ever arrives, and it is not falling in love. And it is not caring too deeply, and it is not having a soft heart. It is assigning permanent meaning to temporary signals. A little attention feels important, then it feels personal. Then it starts to feel like proof. Proof that something special is beginning. Proof that this person is different. Proof that this connection matters. Proof that this might finally become the thing that heals what previous disappointment left behind. And that is where the shift happens. What began as curiosity becomes emotional investment. What began as attraction becomes interpretation. And what began as a simple human interaction quietly becomes a private psychological world. This is the point where many women stop responding to reality and start responding to the story they are building around reality. And once that happens, the pain is no longer caused only by what the other person does. It is caused by the collision between what is happening and what was hoped for. That collision is where overthinking is born, where anxiety becomes loud, where silence starts to feel insulting, and where mixed signals begin to feel heavier than they actually are. This is why a woman can be deeply affected by someone who was never truly hers, never truly consistent, never truly safe, and sometimes never even truly serious. She is not always grieving the person. Often, she is grieving the meaning she gave the person. That is the first truth this conversation demands. Attachment is rarely just about love. Very often, attachment is about projection, anticipation, fear, emotional hunger, and the human tendency to rush ahead of reality. The female mind, especially when emotionally invested, can become extraordinarily generous with interpretation. It can turn fragments into promises, gestures into symbols, chemistry into destiny, and uncertainty into a challenge that must be solved. And what makes this even more difficult is that modern dating environments reward emotional confusion. Inconsistency is often framed as mystery. Emotional unavailability is mistaken for depth. Delayed replies become something to decode. Ambiguity is romanticized, and far too many women are trained, without realizing it, to work harder for what should have arrived clearly. So the issue is not that women are weak. It is that many have been socially conditioned to see emotional labor as proof of sincerity. They have been taught, directly or indirectly, that if something is difficult, it must be valuable. That if someone is distant, they must be wounded. That if the connection is confusing, it must be deep. But confusion is not depth. Anxiety is not intimacy. And emotional starvation is not love. A woman becomes easier to destabilize the moment she begins sourcing her emotional security from what she cannot control. That is the beginning of internal chaos. Because now her mood is tied to a reply. Her peace is tied to consistency from another person. Her confidence is tied to whether she feels chosen, and her sense of worth is quietly leaning on outside behavior. This is where a painful pattern forms. She starts checking, waiting, rereading, explaining, giving extra chances, softening boundaries, and trying to maintain a connection that is not being maintained with the same care on the other side. From the outside, it may look like attachment, but underneath it is usually something more delicate, a dysregulated search for reassurance. The heart says, "I just want clarity," but the nervous system is really saying, "Please make me feel safe again." And that is why this subject cannot be reduced to cliches about confidence or self-love. This goes deeper. It is about the relationship between perception, emotional regulation, expectation, and identity. It is about how quickly a woman hands power to something outside herself and how painful it becomes once that power begins to move unpredictably. One of the most dangerous things that happens in this state is that the woman begins to personalize what was never fully about her. Someone goes cold, and she assumes she became less desirable. Someone withdraws, and she assumes she asked for too much. Someone behaves inconsistently, and she starts auditing herself for mistakes. Was she too available, too soft, too interested, too expressive, too honest, too emotional, too much? But in reality, another person's inconsistency often says more about their capacity than her worth. Another person's confusion is not a reliable mirror. Another person's emotional immaturity is not a final verdict. Another person's avoidance is not proof that she was difficult to love. Yet, once attachment deepens, the mind stops observing behavior neutrally and starts translating everything through self-doubt. And this is the point where women often become exhausted, not because the relationship was real and profound, but because the inner narrative became relentless. This is why one of the strongest psychological shifts a woman can make is learning not to label situations too quickly. A delayed outcome is not automatically rejection. A painful ending is not automatically destruction. A disappointment is not automatically a curse. Human beings suffer not only because life hurts, but because they rush to give pain a permanent identity. The mind wants closure immediately. It wants to know whether something was good or bad, whether it meant something or not, whether the future is ruined or still intact. But real life does not unfold in neat emotional categories. Some endings protect, some delays redirect, some losses reveal what attachment was hiding. Some disappointments save a woman from a life she would later beg to escape. The problem is that in the moment, the nervous system hates uncertainty so much that it would rather settle for a painful interpretation than sit calmly inside the unknown. And yet that calm relationship with uncertainty is exactly where emotional power begins. The woman who matures psychologically does not become emotionless. She becomes slower to worship first impressions and slower to collapse under first disappointments. She develops a quieter and stronger inner posture. She stops saying, "This is terrible, my life is over, I knew it, this always happens to me," and begins saying, "I do not fully know what this means yet." That sounds simple, but it is profound. Because the moment she pauses her interpretation, she weakens the emotional chain reaction that would normally carry her into obsession, panic, or despair. That pause is not passivity, it is discipline. It is wisdom refusing to let pain write conclusions too early. And the woman who learns this becomes far more resilient because she no longer treats every uncomfortable event as a personal collapse. She leaves room for reality to unfold before she surrenders to fear. There is another shift just as powerful, and it changes the emotional atmosphere of a woman's whole life. The belief that she will either receive what is meant for her or something better aligned with her well-being. This is not fantasy, and it is not denial. It is a healthier framework for expectation. Desperation grows where the mind believes there is only one path to happiness. Desperation intensifies when a woman convinces herself that one person, one outcome, one message, one opportunity, one relationship is her only chance at emotional fulfillment. Once the mind starts speaking that language, everything becomes heavy. Every pause feels threatening. Every ambiguity feels urgent. Every disappointment feels catastrophic. But the woman who truly understands her value begins to loosen that grip. She does not need to pretend she feels nothing. She does not need to force herself into indifference. She simply stops treating one uncertain outcome as the foundation of her emotional survival. And in that moment, she becomes harder to control, harder to confuse, and much harder to reduce into someone begging for crumbs. That is where detachment enters, and detachment is one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern psychological conversations. Detachment is not emotional deadness. It is not coldness, cruelty, arrogance, or withdrawal from human connection. True detachment is the ability to care without collapsing, to feel without drowning, to hope without worshiping the outcome, and to love without abandoning oneself. It is an inner structure that allows emotion to move through a person without taking control of their identity. A detached woman can feel sadness without turning it into a lifelong story about being unworthy. She can feel rejection without making it the central fact of her existence. She can feel disappointment without chasing the source of that disappointment for validation. She can mourn without humiliating herself. She can care deeply without becoming mentally imprisoned by what she cares about. This is not a small achievement. It is one of the highest forms of emotional adulthood. And this matters especially in relationships, because many women were never taught the difference between loving and merging. Loving is healthy. Merging is dangerous. Loving says, I value this connection. Merging says, if this connection shifts, I lose myself. Loving allows closeness while preserving center. Merging quietly dissolves center in the name of closeness. Once a woman merges, every movement in the relationship feels existential. A slight change in tone becomes a threat. A late reply becomes a wound. Distance becomes panic. She starts managing her emotional state by monitoring someone else's behavior. And this is why many women end up spiritually and psychologically exhausted, even in situations that never had enough consistency to deserve that level of devotion. They were not just connecting, they were fusing, and fusion always makes a person fragile. At this point, something else becomes essential to understand. Overthinking is not wisdom. It often feels sophisticated because it uses analysis, pattern recognition, and internal dialogue. It feels active, and the mind loves activity because activity creates the illusion of control. But much of overthinking is simply unresolved fear moving in circles. It asks the same questions in different outfits. Why did he say that? Why did he pull back? Why was he warm and then distant? Why did he make me feel chosen and then uncertain? Why did this happen after things felt promising? These questions can feel meaningful, but many times they are just the mind trying to negotiate with ambiguity. The woman hopes that if she can think hard enough, she can discover the key that will undo the pain. But in many cases, the answer has already been given through behavior. Inconsistency is an answer. Evasion is an answer. Lack of effort is an answer. Poor communication is an answer. Emotional unreliability is an answer. Not every answer arrives in words, and the woman who becomes peaceful learns how to read reality without demanding a dramatic explanation. This is where scientific insight becomes helpful, because the experience many women call love is sometimes intensified by systems in the brain that are deeply tied to anticipation and reward. One important paper published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience by Kent Berridge and Morton Kringelbach explains how reward systems in the brain are linked not only to pleasure, but to motivation, wanting, anticipation, and pursuit. That distinction matters, because a woman may believe she is attached because something is deeply fulfilling, when in fact part of the cycle is being strengthened by intermittent reward, uncertainty, and craving. In plain language, unpredictability can intensify pursuit. The brain does not always become most fixated on what is most nourishing. Sometimes it becomes fixated on what is inconsistent enough to keep the reward system activated. That is one reason emotionally unavailable or inconsistent people can feel more addictive than stable ones. Not because they are better, not because they are deeper, but because unpredictability can stimulate longing in ways that steadiness does not, at least initially. And that is a deeply important distinction, because it helps women stop idealizing what is simply dysregulating them. A second insight comes from attachment research, especially the work synthesized by researchers like Mario Mikulincer and Philip Shaver, whose work in attachment theory has shown how early attachment patterns influence adult emotional reactions, relationship anxiety, hyperactivation, avoidance, and the search for reassurance. This matters because a woman who feels devastated by inconsistency is not necessarily dramatic. She may be operating from an attachment system that becomes highly activated when connection feels unstable. In that state, she may protest, over-contact, over-explain, or mentally obsess, not because she is foolish, but because her emotional system is seeking security. That knowledge is powerful, not so that she excuses unhealthy dynamics, but so that she stops shaming herself and starts understanding herself. Because shame never heals attachment wounds. Awareness does. Regulation does. Standards do. Learning to choose what is emotionally safe does. And once a woman understands that her reactions may be shaped by old attachment patterns, she can stop calling herself needy and start asking better questions. Why does uncertainty affect me this strongly? Why am I drawn to what withholds? Why do I work hardest where I feel least secure? And what would it look like to choose peace over chemistry that destabilizes me? That question changes lives. Because a great deal of what many people call chemistry is actually familiarity mixed with activation. It feels intense, electric, consuming, unforgettable. But intensity does not always signal alignment. Sometimes intensity signals an old wound has recognized an old pattern. Sometimes the nervous system feels charged, not because the connection is healthy, but because it resembles what once felt emotionally important and emotionally unsafe at the same time. And unless a woman learns to distinguish peace from boredom, consistency from lack of excitement, and stability from emotional flatness, she may continue to chase the very experiences that injure her while dismissing the experiences that could actually sustain her. This is one of the most transformative maturities a woman can develop. To stop asking only, "Does this feel strong?" and begin asking, "Does this feel clean, respectful, stable, and good for my mind?" Because a connection that constantly unsettles her is not a romantic miracle. It is often a warning wearing beautiful clothes. Now, none of this means a woman should become suspicious of love or closed to emotion. Quite the opposite. The goal is not to become hard. The goal is to become clear. Clear enough to recognize when she is reacting to fantasy more than fact. Clear enough to notice when she is calling emotional labor devotion. Clear enough to walk away from confusion before confusion becomes a lifestyle. Clear enough to understand that silence from the wrong person is not evidence that she must become louder. One of the greatest dignities a woman can cultivate is the ability to let behavior speak and then respond with self-respect. Not every disappointment deserves a speech. Not every betrayal deserves another meeting. Not every inconsistency deserves one more chance to explain itself. Sometimes the deepest self-respect is quiet. Sometimes it looks like no dramatic exit, no final paragraph, no attempt to be more understood by someone determined to remain unclear. Sometimes healing begins the moment she stops arguing with what reality has already shown her. This is also why self-relationship sits at the center of detachment. A woman who enjoys her own company, trusts her judgment, and has built an inner life she respects is far less likely to cling to what diminishes her. She may still feel hurt, she may still grieve, but she will not negotiate away her dignity just to avoid being alone. She will not stay where she is chronically confused just because occasional affection keeps her hopeful. She will not call scraps a feast. She will not lower her standard of love beneath the standard of care she can offer herself. And that changes her whole romantic life, because people can feel when someone is dating from hunger and when someone is dating from wholeness. Hunger creates urgency, over-availability, self-abandonment, and fear-based attachment. Wholeness creates pace, discernment, steadiness, and standards. One chases proof, the other evaluates character. One asks, "How do I keep this?" The other asks, "Is this even worthy of my inner world?" Those are not small differences. They determine almost everything. And this inner home a woman builds within herself is not built through slogans. It is built through repeated acts of emotional honesty and self-respect. It is built when she stops romanticizing people who confuse her. It is built when she notices how her body feels around inconsistency and chooses not to override that signal. It is built when she lets disappointment be painful without letting it define her identity. It is built when she gives herself the tenderness she keeps trying to extract from emotionally unavailable people. It is built when she fills her days with discipline, nourishment, meaningful routine, prayerful stillness, reflection, useful work, beauty, rest, and relationships that do not require performance. It is built when she stops treating romantic attention as the highest proof that her life is going well. Because once a woman makes someone else the center of emotional meaning, she begins orbiting what should have been only one part of life. But when she returns to center, everything changes. She stops pursuing what depletes her and starts protecting what restores her. This is the part many people miss. Detachment does not make a woman less loving. It makes her love more truthfully. She becomes less likely to confuse urgency with devotion, less likely to stay where she is, merely tolerated, less likely to keep translating low effort into hidden depth, less likely to mistake being wanted occasionally for being cherished consistently, less likely to break herself trying to earn what should have arrived with dignity. And because of that, she becomes more available for love that is mutual, calm, principled, and emotionally clean. She becomes better, not worse, at intimacy. Because healthy intimacy requires boundaries, self-knowledge, regulation, and the ability to remain a whole person while loving another whole person. It is not built on panic. It is not built on obsession. It is not built on powerlessness. There is also a moral beauty in this kind of detachment. It protects a woman from becoming manipulative, vengeful, or consumed by the need to win emotionally. When someone disappoints her, she does not have to humiliate them, expose them, chase them, or prove that she was the better person. She can simply recognize what is beneath her standard and leave. That quiet strength is rare. It comes from knowing that dignity is more valuable than dramatic victory. And once a woman understands that, she becomes less reactive and more formidable, not because she is cold, but because she is anchored. She no longer needs the last word to feel real. She no longer needs to force closure where character has already provided it. She no longer needs to be chosen by everyone because she has stopped abandoning herself. And perhaps the deepest shift of all is this: she stops seeing suffering as proof of seriousness. This is one of the most harmful illusions in modern emotional culture, the idea that the more painful something is, the more meaningful it must be. But suffering by itself does not sanctify a connection. Struggle does not automatically indicate depth. Emotional turmoil is not proof of destiny. Sometimes it is simply evidence that something is not aligned with peace, honesty, and mutual care. The woman who learns this begins to release an enormous amount of unnecessary pain. She stops equating longing with value. She stops glorifying unavailable people. She stops turning confusion into poetry when it should have remained a red flag. She stops admiring what starves her. And that is when her standards stop being decorative and become real. So when a woman enters what people casually call her unbothered era, what is actually happening beneath the surface is much more profound than indifference. She is not becoming numb. She is becoming integrated. Her feelings no longer drag her by force. Her mind no longer rushes to catastrophic conclusions. Her worth no longer rises and falls with outside attention. Her peace is no longer leased out to unstable people. She becomes capable of witnessing life rather than being devoured by every fluctuation in it. And there is a tremendous grace in that state. She can enjoy love without worshiping it. She can appreciate beauty without clinging to it. She can endure loss without becoming bitterness itself. She can remain soft without remaining easy to misuse. She can stay open without staying unguarded. She can walk away with tears in her eyes and dignity in her spine. That is power in its mature form. And the beautiful thing is that this transformation does not require a woman to become someone artificial. It asks her to return to what was always most intelligent within her: her clarity, her self-respect, her patience, her discernment, her trust that what is good does not require self-betrayal, and her understanding that what is meant with sincerity will not demand that she destroy her peace to keep it. Once that understanding settles deeply into her, life begins to feel different, not because pain disappears, and not because disappointment never comes, but because she no longer hands every painful moment the authority to define her. She becomes slower to attach, wiser in how she observes, gentler with herself, firmer with reality, and less willing to chase what has not earned access to her inner world. And in that state, she becomes not only more attractive in the external sense, but more alive, more stable, more luminous, and more free. That is the psychology so many women spend years trying to understand. Why they overgive, why they overthink, why they stay too long, why they crave what confuses them, why they feel shattered by what was inconsistent from the beginning, and why detachment feels so difficult until it becomes the very thing that saves them. The answer is not that they cared too much. It is that they often cared without enough structure, hoped without enough grounding, and invested before reality had earned that level of trust. But once a woman sees that clearly, everything begins to reorganize. She stops begging life to reverse what hurt her and starts allowing life to refine her through it. She stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begins asking, "What is this showing me about what I must no longer ignore?" She stops reaching for emotional rescue from what wounded her and starts becoming a place of safety within herself. And once she reaches that point, something remarkable happens. She does not need to chase peace anymore, because peace begins to recognize her as home. Before you scroll, watch this next. It's now appearing on your screen. Why the most desired woman is the one who walks away first. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.